Okay, we can begin.
Hi, the webinar will start shortly. We'll just wait a couple of minutes to let everyone in. Welcome everyone. My name is Jess. I'm a project assistant at Scrap and a diplomacy student at SOAS. It's really great to have you all here to launch the first of our webinars looking at the rise of US-China nuclear tensions. Today, we are honoured to be joined by three fantastic speakers who will share their insight on the deterrence and strategic cultures of the two states. So just before we start, I will run through a little housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and it will be published on the Scrap YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And once all the speakers have given their presentations, we will open up the floor for an audience Q&A session. Please add your questions via the Q&A function. If possible, it would be great to have your name and affiliation, and you can start leaving questions right now. Now I will hand over to my colleague Gemma to introduce herself and Scrap Weapons.
Thank you, Jess. Hi everyone, my name is Gemma. I'm also a student at SOAS in International Studies and Diplomacy. So a little bit about Scrap. Scrap Weapons project focuses on realizing the legal commitment to nuclear and general disarmament in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and convening a full special session on disarmament at the UN General Assembly with the contribution of a draft treaty on world disarmament and the prototypes of global weapons striking system. Scrap also has a broader engagement with feminist perspectives and interreligious dialogue, and primarily seeks global security through prompt WMD elimination and general controls on other weapons. So the focus of today's webinar is the background to the increasing military tensions between the US and China, the idea that we might be entering a new Cold War, and the implications for the global disarmament campaign. As the US and China spend vast sums expanding and modernizing their armaments, including weapons of mass destruction, and as tensions between Russia and the West continue to rise, the case for general and complete disarmament could not be more pressing or clearer. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Jess.
So I'm delighted to introduce some really fantastic speakers, and Scrap is really grateful for their time and contribution. So first of all, we have John Isaacs, a senior fellow at the Council for a Livable World, where his work focuses on national security issues in US Congress, nuclear weapons, missile defense, overseas military interventionism and defense budgets. Isaacs is one of the leaders in the arms control community and has long been an expert on the workings of Congress. He has represented the Council and Centre on Capitol Hill since 1978, and Isaacs previously served as a legislative assistant on foreign affairs to Representative Stephen Solarz, a legislative representative on foreign policy and defense budget for Americans for Democratic Action, and a foreign service officer in Vietnam. He has represented the Council and Centre on Capitol Hill since 1978. Next, we have Cameron Hunter, who specialises in the intersection of technology and security, with a particular focus on nuclear weapons, outer space, and critical theories of technology. He was awarded a PhD from the University of Bristol after completing an ESRC-funded project on American responses to China's rise in space. Cameron was previously a researcher at the US Library of Congress and taught at Bristol and Leicester universities. He is currently a research associate on the ERC towards a third nuclear age, a project, and is working on a book critiquing the technological determinism and underpinning predictions of a US-China arms race in outer space. And finally, we have Dan Plesch, Professor of International Studies and Diplomacy at SOAS University of London and Director of the Scrap Weapons Project. He was founding director of the British American Security Information Council in Washington, DC from 1986 to 2000 and senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. He was part of the international coalitions for the nuclear test ban, small arms control and arms trade measures. So now I want to give the floor to John Isaacs.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to speak about what certainly could be a new Cold War starting between the United States and China. If you have lived long enough, which I have, you will remember the US-Soviet Cold War. It was a period of constant military, political, and economic confrontation that fortunately never developed into a hot war. And despite how close we came during the Cuban Missile Crisis about some 60 years ago, the two countries avoided a nuclear war, thank God. But both countries, United States and Soviet Union, engaged in dramatic nuclear weapons buildup that made no sense militarily, economically, or politically. At its peak, Russia had built and deployed some 40,000 nuclear weapons, and the United States some 30,000 nuclear weapons. And both countries engaged in various proxy wars. Ironically, the United States, I think, can consider itself the victor in the Cold War, not because of the size of our military forces, not because of the number of nuclear weapons, but rather the weaknesses in the Soviet economic system. As we all know, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, following the demise of, well, some people probably weren't even born who are on this call, this Zoom. Soviet Union dissolved following the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the demise of the various Russian puppet regimes. In other words, talking about Cold Wars, whether it's between US and Russia, US and China, and other countries are involved in this with China, to use the cliche, we've seen this movie before. Then, during the other Cold War, and now, American military leaders and militant hawks in Congress, with the enthusiastic backing of military corporations, took advantage of the concern over the Soviet Union and now China to sell their wares. And those advocating military confrontation with China, unfortunately, have been very successful in the last year. This year, Congress added $25 billion, which is about 18.5 billion pounds, to the already huge US military budget request. And while the US budget process is still ongoing for the current fiscal year, the new US military budget will top some $768 billion or 570 billion pounds. Now, for those who pay attention to somewhat to the United States, you may understand that there's not total friendship and amity between the Democratic and Republican parties, as opposed to Conservative and Labor in the UK, I'm sure. But on the issue of confronting China, both parties are largely united in their hostility to China. Now, during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, many of us who opposed the militarization of the confrontation argued that the militarization, those in favor of militarization were really behaving as if the Soviets were 10 feet tall. The same exaggerations of the other country's strength is happening again with China. A very hawkish senator from Arkansas named Tom Cotton spoke of China doubling, tripling, or quadrupling their nuclear stockpile over the next decade. And the US Indo-Pacific commander agreed it was a problem. But in point of fact, China has some 350 nuclear weapons compared to about 5,800 for the United States. Again, 350 for China, 5,800 for the United States. Even if the Chinese actually build up, as Senator Cotton thinks they will, it'll still leave the country far behind Russia and the United States in terms of number of nuclear weapons. Now, Senator Cotton represents some of the more extreme elements in the US political system, because he's also said, we need, this is a quote, we need to beat this evil empire and consign the Chinese communists to the ash heap of history. The ash heap of history. Good luck with that. And as there is exaggerations about Soviet military strength, there's similar exaggeration the size of the Chinese military budget. For example, there was widespread concern expressed over the recent China's announcement of a 6.8% increase in military spending. However, even with that growth of the Chinese military budget, which is real, the Chinese military budget comes to about $193 billion, or 146 billion pounds. Again, $193 billion in dollars for China compared to the US current military budget of about 768 billion. As with the Soviet Union, there's a tendency to see the Chinese as 10 feet tall. One more example. The Pentagon's 2020 China Military Power Report claims that the Chinese Navy is the largest in the world, 350 ships and submarines for China compared to 293 for the United States. Sounds like a tremendous deficit for the United States. But the report neglects to mention that the US Navy has at least a 2-to-1 advantage in naval tonnage over China and a 10-to-1 lead in carrier-based aircraft, plus a great lead in nuclear power strategic submarines. So again, then and now, we tend to exaggerate the strength of the opposition. And while the Soviets certainly had weaknesses, as shown by its dissolution, China too has a lot of weaknesses. For one, the Chinese economy has slowed markedly in the final months of last year and over the last few years, after enormous progress over previous decades. Two, the Chinese birth rate has declined, has plummeted for the 5th straight year. That could lead to a demographic crisis that could undermine its economy and even its political stability. Three, as I've already pointed out, despite the real Chinese nuclear buildup and the new ICBM silos, they are still far behind the US and Russia in terms of nuclear weapons. Four, Chinese aggressive actions towards its Asian neighbors, its claims to wide swaths of the ocean, its creation of artificial islands, its confrontations with India and Australia are doing a very good job of alienating other countries in the region. And the fifth weakness, I believe, is for China's determination of President Xi to be leader for life, where he's squeezing out all modes of dissent, whether it's his own, the rest of the leadership or the public, then that may ultimately prove very unhealthy to the country in the long run. Now, I'm not predicting the demise of China for sure, but of course, no one predicted the demise of the Soviet Union, not even the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, to be clear, I am no fan of China. Its transgressions include the back blanket surveillance state, which reminds me very much of George Orwell's 1984 novel, its suppression of Uyghurs, if not at concentration camps, its takeover of Hong Kong in violation of previous agreements, its threats to Taiwan, Tibet, and India, and its theft of intellectual rights. But I strongly believe, despite these differences, that the Western and American confrontation with China should be a competition of ideas and economics, not two military buildups. Building up for a war with China might be good for the military-industrial complex in this country, but it's very bad policy and would divert funds for more pressing current and long-range threats facing our nation and the world, like global health, economic recovery, cybersecurity, and infrastructure. Moreover, a confrontation between US and China could have devastating economic consequences for both countries, and to say nothing of the international economic order. US goods and services trade with China totaled some $615 billion in 2020, or about $455 billion pounds, 455 billion pounds. And China was the United States' third largest export market in 2020. And of course, the two countries have the largest gross domestic product in the world. So if you think a Russian invasion of Ukraine will be a total disaster, which I do, a military confrontation between the United States and China could be multiples of that. As the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Adam Smith of Washington State warned, quote, "I think building our defense policy around the idea that we have to be able to beat China in an all-out war is wrong. If we get into an all-out war with China, we're all screwed anyway." He speaks quite frankly. I think instead we should be prepared to collaborate with China even as we compete with China, but not engage in the military confrontation. There are issues already where we can compete, where we can cooperate with China and have to some extent, certainly economic issues in trade, climate change, rules for the road and space, North Korea, and confidence and transparency building nuclear arms measures. So there are areas where the two countries can work together. Now, in small bit of positive news, the US Congress is currently working on two bills that are designed to promote and improve US competitiveness China, as opposed to simply build up a US military forces. The House of Representatives is considering a bill this week that would do that, and the Senate passed a comparable measure last year. So for the moment, Congress is doing both, adding money for the military budget, but also adding money for improving US competitiveness with China. The most important thing we can do in the United States, in my humble opinion, is to strengthen our democracy and economy at home so we can lead with the power of our example, and we should be avoiding another confrontation with another major country. Thank you. I look forward to the next two presentations. I'm done.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting and great to see how some of the, it's definitely been blown out of proportion, the kind of the numbers, how they don't quite stack up. I think that's really, really interesting. Yeah. So now I'd like to hand the floor over to Cameron Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, organisers, and thank you to John for setting me up so well. I think there are going to be some points crossover potentially. Can you see the slides okay?
It's very large type.
Okay, so my key points here. So I should say, first of all, I'm not a historian, although I do take a historical perspective to my work on US-China relations. So in many ways, the sort of sources that I'm drawing on here are from hardworking historians, as opposed to international relations scholars. I once heard somebody say that international relations scholarship is where history goes to die. And so I try to be one of the IR scholars that actually reads what the historians are writing on this. And that hopefully I can share with you some of their insights, and we can find that useful for our discussion as we go on. So I really just have two key points. The first is that contemporary US-China competition falls short.
Excuse me, Dr. Hunter, sorry if I interrupt you. We have trouble seeing the slides.
Oh, really?
We see only the central part, so yes.
If you could shrink the type size, then it would all fit.
Would it be better if you just display the slides for me?
The advantages and pitfalls of technology. There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, apologies for that. Yeah, and so yeah, I'm going to look at how we can sort of look at the breadth and intensity of contemporary US-China competition and compare it to US-USSR competition. And my second key point is that although US-China competition looks quite bad at the present moment, things used to be significantly worse. So I'm just going to briefly hit some of these sort of high-level points on US-China relations during the Cold War. The picture there is from Alex Wallerstein's visualization of the 1954 US nuclear war plan, and you can see that China gets hit with a huge number of nuclear weapons, and at the time couldn't be differentiated in the war plan from a general attack on the Soviet Union. So regardless of whether China was going to be involved in a superpower showdown, it was probably going to get hit with huge numbers of nuclear weapons either way. And I think that does tell you something quite important about the way in which China figured into the US-USSR showdown as far as US strategic planners were concerned. So the real sort of worst point in US-China relations in the 20th century was the Korean War. Hundreds of thousands of battle deaths on the US and Chinese sides alone, not including the many, many more civilians that were killed in that conflict. Around the Korean War and also around the Taiwan Strait crises of the 1950s, the US made nuclear threats against China in a somewhat veiled manner, but as far as we can tell, they were perceived as nuclear threats in Beijing. Relations were so bad, there were no formal diplomatic relations whatsoever, so any kind of dialogue had to happen in secret, and it doesn't seem like really any dialogue did take place between the US and China until Nixon's famous trip in 1972. There was a partnership between the US and China in the Cold War that was quite productive for both parties. But the centerpiece of that really was around the mutual interest in competing with the Soviet Union and kind of offsetting the Soviets' power in East Asia. Although, despite that kind of somewhat sort of Machiavellian motivation for having a partnership, it did include sort of science and technology exchanges, and cultural exchanges, and it did develop into something more than just a simple sort of cynical military sort of partnership. It fell far short of an alliance. It's important to note. Even after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, US elites still viewed China as a valuable partner and attempted to pursue a continuation of the partnership, but popular discourse, particularly coming out of Congress, in the 1990s, and now it feels very much more prominent in sort of more pop cultural forms as well. The sort of sense of competition and rivalry started to emerge after Tiananmen Square. Next slide, please. So where does China's nuclear arsenal fit in with all of this? China pursued nuclear weapons quite early on after the establishment of the People's Republic in 1949. Mao Zedong had his personal take on Marxist-Leninism, which already is a somewhat techno-optimist philosophy, and Mao Zedong was no different. Plus, you have the added kind of component of Chinese nationalism, of China needing to shake off the legacy of its colonial experiences and to stand up as a major power in the world. So part of this was encapsulated in the sort of pursuit of technological spectaculars, and the Chinese characters there for Liang Dan Yixin, 2 bombs, 1 satellite program, which I strongly recommend Nicola Leveringhaus's work on this, which was 2 nuclear bombs. We've got the 1964 test pictured there at the top, and the later hydrogen bomb tests at the bottom. and a space satellite as well. The goals of the first nuclear test were publicly announced along with the government announcement that China had tested the bomb. And it very plainly states that the point of China pursuing a nuclear weapons program was to break the superpower nuclear monopoly, and especially to counter what it called US imperialism and nuclear blackmail. And as I've just said, it is noteworthy that the US did make what amount to nuclear threats against China in the 1950s. And so we can sort of see the way in which the Chinese government then framed its own nuclear program as a response and a counter to American nuclear power and its influence in the region. Interestingly, the Chinese military didn't actually pursue an intercontinental missile capability that could hit the US until a bit later. The program started in the 1970s, but it had a lot of problems, mainly because of the Cultural Revolution and the disruption that caused to the Chinese science and technology sector. So it wasn't actually until the early 1980s that China was capable of hitting the US with nuclear weapons, the continental US in any case. Next slide, please. So I've tried to provide a bit of context on US-China relations and where China's nuclear weapons program kind of fitted into that. Now I want to look at the scope and the intensity of competition between the two examples. So I'll try and go through this quite quickly and keep it at a high level. We can discuss it more afterwards. And of course, John has already mentioned a few of these things. The sort of way in which the two sides face down in each example is very different. The US and USSR had blocks of formal military treaty allies, the Warsaw Pact and NATO. There's not really an equivalent in contemporary US-China relations. ASEAN is one regional Asian security organization that you might think might be somewhat equivalent to NATO, but really is not comparable in terms of its strength in the security aspects, military security especially. China currently only has one treaty military ally, and that's North Korea. And there's a lot of literature on that. If you're interested in, you can see how that is both a benefit and a drawback for the PRC. The US in East Asia obviously has treaty allies such as Japan, and it also has a great number of informal partners, but again, nothing that really is equivalent to NATO in the sort of height of the Cold War in Europe. The USSR at various times had a pretty clear goal of attempting to spread world communism. It's pretty debatable as to how much they really put that into practice at different times, but certainly Stalin and Khrushchev at various times presented this as their goal publicly. And in response, the US famously had a strategy of containment. Today, US and Chinese strategies are quite unclear. I think most people would tell you in Washington, even if they are China hawks, would tell you that the US doesn't really have a strong, clear strategy in response to China. And there's a huge amount of debate as to what China's current policies are really aimed at overall, beyond strengthening its economy and military. For what end exactly, it's not exactly clear at this point. In the Cold War, and John really emphasized this, you were talking about competition really on the global level, intense security competition. In the US-China case, we don't see intense security competition globally, but we do see very far-reaching economic competition. Next slide, please. So we've looked a bit at sort of where competition takes place in these two cases, and then let's just quickly look at how intense it is. So in the 20th century Cold War case, you're looking at two very conventionally heavily armed blocks of states that actually share a heavily militarized border in Europe, and were really prepared to start a conventional war and almost certainly then a nuclear war inevitably in Europe. talking about dozens of divisions of tanks, artillery, infantry. This is just not really comparable in the US-China case. Potentially the US would intervene in a war over Taiwan. That is not clear, in part because Taiwan is not a US treaty ally. John again mentioned the proxy warfare aspect. This is where the term Cold War for the 20th century really only makes sense if you are very Eurocentric in your thinking, because the Cold War was not very cold in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, Central America, Sub-Saharan Africa. At least publicly, there doesn't seem to be any sign that China is doing things like heavily arming groups that are opposing US interests, or funding groups that will then actively go out and shoot at American troops. In the Cold War, famously, there were many nuclear crises, and in the US-China case, since the diplomatic relations were re-established in the late 1970s, at least, we've not seen any US-China nuclear crises. We have seen some diplomatic crises and incidents, which were serious in their own way, and have led potentially to a growing sense of paranoia amongst the leaders of the PRC in Beijing. But the level of crisis, the intensity of crisis, is not comparable. Okay, next slide, please. So my three conclusions here. US-China relations, thankfully, are not as bad as they were in the 1950s, when they were extremely violent and tense, and could potentially even have gone nuclear had the US chosen to. That doesn't mean to say that they're good. It just means to say that we should remember that they were much worse, and we should try and be optimistic about where they could go. We're not currently looking at a US-China arms race, although there is definitely arms competition, but we should be careful not to blur these two concepts, because calling arms competition an arms race could potentially cause alarmism and exacerbate the problem. And similarly, competition between great powers is not inevitably a Cold War. There are other forms of competition that can take place, and I think the geographical and political factors that I outlined show how the stage isn't set for a superpower showdown that we saw in the 20th century. Looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. It was really good to have a comparison and to see on both sides the differences in the dynamics between the original Cold War and what we out to call the new Cold War today. So thank you very much, and I'll give the floor to Professor Dunplesh.
Thank you very much, Gemma Sabatini, Cameron, and John. One new friend, one old friend. I want to elaborate a little bit more on the dynamics that John and Cameron have outlined, but to start and to finish really by talking about what can the role of states not intimately involved in the confrontation and civil society be. These issues shouldn't be treated as a spectator sport or as something beyond our reach. I think we know, certainly John and I have been involved in processes where highly focused technical and strong public voices brought some measure of common sense to leaders in the confrontation between the West and the Soviet Union, and where left to themselves, the nuclear logic would have ended in disaster. And I think one only has to look at Benoit Pelopidas's wonderful work on, I think his great phrase is the incredible lightness of luck, that how we have survived so far is in large part by luck. We are riding our luck now. The romantic period of the end of the Cold War and arms control and disarmament is now long past. People talk of a stepping stones approach, and they talk of this amongst the rubble of the arms control architecture of the last 40 years. And I think it is a problem to be being content with such a small approach as stepping stones when a number of the people we're engaging with have done their best effectively to reduce the existing architecture to rubble. So we, I think, need to rebuild the architecture and the approach to weapons control. And I'll come back to this in our project when I close my remarks. But I want, if I can, to build a little bit on John and Cameron's remarks. In terms of the work I've engaged with in discussions a little while ago with Chinese and American officials, I think the American operating pattern of its military forces and the development of more forces around China is much more concerning to the PLA, to the Chinese military than they would like to admit. That ever since the 1950s and intensifying and not halted with the end of the Soviet Union, the United States has had a very assertive patrolling approach to Chinese airspace and Chinese sea space. And in this context, this is the other side of the coin, which is so rarely written about when we look at China expanding in the South China Sea and elsewhere. These are indeed acts which upset and frighten its neighbors, but part of the context for that is the close proximity of US projection forces. And as John so excellently has explored, this asymmetry of power projection by the United States with respect to China compared to any ability of China to have similar impact on the United States is one which ought to be much better represented. And perhaps our student body can help challenge these one-sided approaches as they continue to get repeated in the press. We've had some discussion before, but from the Chinese perspective, while we hear a great deal of hypersonic weapons, of glide weapons, first of all, these are types of weapons that the Russians and the United States toyed with in the Cold War and decided not to deploy, really because good old ballistic missiles were more reliable and effective at getting the job done. So there's a lot of scaremongering, and one might say heightened status potentially for Beijing with some of these systems, but compared to everyday US technology, they still lag far, far behind. And I just want to mention two technologies which the United States has developed and continues to incrementally improve over recent years. The first is air-to-surface missiles that can be launched from any fighter jet. The what I would call the most important weapon no one's ever heard of is the acronym is the JASSM, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, which within a couple of years will have 1,000 nautical mile range and can be fitted to any F-16 or fighter jet or carrier-based plane. This gives strategic deep range into mainland China from American tactical fighters. And this is just one example of what China looks at when it comes to the military buildup. And the other is the improvements in United States Navy's ability to intercept enemy ballistic missiles. And we've seen very considerable increases in effectiveness in these types of weapon systems in the recent past. And this combination means that perhaps from Moscow, but certainly from Beijing, they do seriously wonder whether they actually have a deterrent against American conventional strike power. And that is potentially very destabilizing. It's even more destabilizing if in general, Western publics and decision makers aren't aware that we appear so threatening and capable to Beijing. From the point of view of conflict analysis, that is a bad and dangerous dynamic to have going on. So I think one of our missions in this series is to look at some of these asymmetries, and without, as John and Camera said, having anything to say for the PRC government, but to provide a rather more objective and critical analysis. Because sadly, the sources that we would tend to rely upon in the olden days that John and I remember, the Financial Times, Reuters, the BBC, the Guardian even, in the UK, I find not providing this level of critical analysis and this balanced opinion. Too often one sees a repetition and a repetition of Western government points of view without balance and challenge. And that, I think, is a problem that we in civil society need to follow. Now, I want to conclude by talking about what the arms control and disarmament agenda might be. Now, John, in his bio, said he took up anti-arms in a position in the late 1970s. I have a similar antique trajectory. And in those days, the objective and the framework of world disarmament, of general disarmament, was part of the intellectual structure of government and civil society. In 1978, a year before John took the first job and before I became active, there was a successful UN special session on disarmament. Now, there is actually on the books, ready to go if anyone wants to get it going, the mandate for a fourth UN special session on disarmament. And I think we need to rally behind that notion, bring it front and center, and start to talk to like-minded groups about what sort of issues we can engage with. Because if you look at the small print of analyses on Taiwan, on Chinese-Japan relations, and so on and so forth, somewhere buried in these reports is a call for redoubled arms control or for missile controls. But there isn't, these days, an overarching concept. It's as if we were arguing about for and against solar panels or national restrictions on CO2 emissions without having the overarching concept of the UNFCCC and the COP26, for example, that process. So we need to get that context back, and we need to put more specific demands into it, and to link up individual analysts and states looking for controls on particular parts of the weapon systems. And our contribution to that, one, is to bring forward you might say as a provocation, a draft treaty incorporating past best practices on global disarmament, but also to say that, and to demonstrate through our project, that in the age of Google Earth, hiding weapons has become much more difficult. And we know in every time a crisis kicks off, satellite photographs appear, whether it's of Chinese missile fields or Russian deployments, although we see rather less of United States missile test firings, which of course are also going on. So this combination of improved verification and jump-starting a negotiating process, we hope can help reframe, defuse the confrontation. And I think the problem at the bottom line is whether it's just the US-China relationship, which is bad enough, or more generally, really, can we realistically say that the world in general can carry on producing $2 trillion worth of armaments every year without a major war resulting? Again, the analogy to climate change. Can we carry on pumping out CO2 forever and not have a cataclysm? Well, I think once you put it that way, you can see that actually we need to put the brakes on. If it isn't an arms race, if it's an arms competition, we need to damp it down now. And part of that has to be political and economic, but part of it also has to be to offer a technical, one might say, old-style solutions of arms control and disarmament. And we hope that this series will do that. And I hope that we can continue this discussion with our faculty, with our students, and with distinguished speakers such as John and Cameron. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. That was really interesting to hear your thoughts and provide some tangible solutions on an issue that can often seem quite hopeless, and definitely reinforces the need for disarmament, not just in the US-China context, but on an international level. So now I'd like to open up the floor for Q&A session. Our chat box is already very full with lots and lots of questions. So I'm going to kick this off with a question from Ariel, who is a co-chair of a policy working at the Youth for the TPNW, and she's a big fan of Third Nuclear Age. So her question is whether the panelists think that there is a connection between what we had in the Cold War and the Third Nuclear Age, and whether anything that we have learned from the Cold War era can help us understand and prepare for future conflict. So I'll ask Cameron to address that first.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ariel. So, yeah, I think Third Nuclear Age concept is something that my boss is working on. Andrew Futter is the PI on the ERC Third Nuclear Age project. And him and his co-author Ben Zala, which sound like you're familiar with the piece. The Third Nuclear Age concept is really looking at ways in which the legacy of technologies during the Cold War, nuclear weapons, command and control systems, and more esoteric methods of attack like anti-satellite technologies, have now kind of ended up in a kind of new configuration with great powers interested in some of these technologies that they weren't previously that interested in, things like hypersonic weapons, developing more kinds of anti-satellite weapons, for example, rather than just kind of testing and stockpiling very, very few. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The sort of the dynamics that we're seeing that are emerging now over the sort of past 10, 15 years are very much sort of an outgrowth of the legacy of the US-USSR Cold War.
Thank you. And John, do you have anything to add?
Let me unmute first. The United States is not very good at learning from history. I find we repeat a lot of mistakes that we made many times before. And the problem right now is you can look at the same facts about the Cold War and how it ended and come to one conclusion that I have, which is a total waste of money. It's dangerous time. We're lucky that we didn't engage either in a hot war or have a nuclear war, and that we should do everything in our power to avoid a new Cold War with China. I'm afraid others will look at the end of the Cold War and say, it worked. The United States won. We beat the Soviet Union. They ended up in the ash heap of history. So if we did it once, we can do it again. So there are lessons of history, but I'm afraid they're competing lessons that people have learned.
Definitely, thank you. And Professor Flesch?
You're on mute.
You're on mute, Dan.
Muting itself. It's a very good question, because I think there's a tendency to look at history through the lens that suits you, rather than to take a broader view. I think looking back, having lived through a significant part of it and worked in a significant part of it, I think at some level I and those I was working with underestimated the I can't think of a better word than malevolence, or perhaps too soft on the Soviet Union in some respects. But I also think more importantly that we weren't as aware as we should have been of how dangerous the situation was. And I think one example I'll give very briefly is immortalized in the TV series Deutschland 83, that in the autumn of 1983, there were millions of people in the West demonstrating against nuclear war and missile deployments. And at exactly the same time, the Soviet Union and the West almost went to nuclear war. There were certain events in Germany in terms of missile deployments that started an action-reaction cycle where the Soviet Union convinced itself that nuclear war had actually started. We weren't aware of this at all at the time. And one should go back and say, well, we told you so. We were scared enough at the time to be demonstrating in far larger numbers than take the streets over climate change. But we didn't actually really know quite how dangerous the situation was. So again, my lesson from that is that we are still subjected to a blizzard of disinformation where even our leaders, or more might say, even say specifically, especially our leaders, don't themselves understand the dangers and of the forces they're controlling. And so if there's any lesson, it's be even more scared, I guess, about the lack of adult supervision on these systems and crises, which are now far more complex than they were even in those days. I'll try and keep subsequent answers a bit shorter. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Professor Plesch. I have a question on the chat from Sunita. If the US and China relations are not as tense as they were in the 1950s, what should we make of China's attempt to dominate the South China Sea? So I'd like to hear Dr. Hunter's thoughts first. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Gemma, thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I mean, part of what I wanted to make clear in my introductory remarks was that, yeah, the US-China relations were tense in the 1950s. They were also extremely violent. We're talking about violence on a huge industrial scale, with the potential for nuclear weapons to be used against Chinese military and civilian targets by the US. So that's kind of that's the crux of why I think that the situation we're looking at is just not anywhere near as bad, thankfully. That being said, yes, China has territorial sort of goals in its region, which are rather threatening. They're rather frightening to its neighboring governments. But I think the real comparison there is look at the means that China is using to press its claims in the South China Sea. They're a combination of legal and extra-legal, including the use of force in the sense that, yes, they're sailing ships and you know, building things. You know, that is a use of force, but they're not killing people. They're not shooting at Americans. They're not shooting at the Philippine Navy or the Vietnamese Navy. The potential is there for that, but I think the comparison, you have to be very careful that you're not comparing two things that are actually fundamentally unlike each other.
Of course, thank you very much. Dr. Isaacs, would you like to comment on that?
Elevated to be doctor now, good. In the 50s, there are terrible relations. Various countries have terrible relations with other countries, and they're not at quite as great a consequence as they might be at different times. I mean, right now, China's had tremendous development in the last couple decades, economically, politically, militarily. So if the US and China were confronting each other at times before, I think now it's much more dangerous because clearly China feels its new strength and wants to compete with the United States for dominance of the economic system and certainly the political situation in Asia. I mean, I think there is good reason to be concerned about Chinese building these artificial islands and claiming wide swaths of the South China Sea. And the possibility is now much more dangerous. Even if things aren't as tense as they were in the 50s, they're more dangerous because the competing powers now that both sides have.
Well, I sort of would say that Chinese actions are dangerous and reprehensible, but I would put them in the context of the Chinese facing overwhelming military inferiority compared to US power projection capabilities. And people rarely mention the Japanese military, which is now equipped with these JASSM air-to-surface missiles, and its naval and air forces are truly formidable. And the US has other allies in the region that never get factored into these questions. And something which we might look to redress between us is the absence of the bean counting charts which populated the television screens and newspapers of the 1980s and beyond before, how many tanks and divisions the Russians and the Chinese had. Well, once you look at these numbers with respect to the Chinese United States, then the picture is very, very different to the one which we're often presented with.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Dr. Plesch. I have a question directed to you in the chat. So what are your predictions for disarmament goals, as well as what does that mean for further proxy wars worldwide? Professor Plesch?
Oh, you want me to pick it up? Well, we discussed this a good deal. I think I would hope the prospects for disarmament are very good. I fear they're not. Hence, we look to try and redress the balance. And I think we continue to see an intensification of conflict in the region and through proxy wars. Personally, I don't think we will see any Chinese incursion towards Taiwan. I think the Chinese are playing a much longer game, have a lot longer and more predictable strategy, and I can't see how it would be at all rational for China to act militarily against Taiwan. But I could be wrong.
Thank you. And I think just before we wrap up, I want to ask one final question from Amma Al-Halti, who is an IR student at SOAS. And his question to the panel. So nuclear strategy has developed historically in a responsive manner to counter security threats perceived by the opponent. However, there has not been a code of conduct guiding such a race of threats and weaponization resulting in irreversible consequences, e.g. mutual assured destruction. To the panelists, do you see a possibility for the current leadership experiencing common threats on humanity, such as COVID and climate change, to grasp the need for a code of conduct to restrict such technologies and their emerging security threats? So I'll put that to you first, Mr. Isaacs.
Right now, going to the previous question, it's hard to be optimistic about goals for disarmament because Russia, China, the United States, excuse me, are all going in the wrong direction. The code of conduct would make sense, but right now, China and the United States, to say nothing of Russia, are in so much loggerheads that they're not making much progress even on smaller issues, much less larger issues. So I can't be optimistic there'll be a code of conduct. You'd think one would be clearly in everyone's interest to have a code of conduct for space, for in terms of anti-satellite weapons, to blowing up satellites in space, satellites being able to attack other satellites. But even there, there's no progress that I see anytime soon.
Great. And Dr. Hunter?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with what John said there. Yeah, we're not really looking at a situation where, yes, if you look at the history of the Cold War, I think we can make a useful comparison here in terms of how do leaders tackle existential threats. And yeah, I mean, the answer over the past sort of 100 years or so has been that they don't really put that much effort into doing so. You know, even with the arms control and disarmament treaties that were brought in during the Cold War, they did figure into superpower competition. And you know, infamously with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, signing up its signatories to eventual disarmament. You know, you had the Russian ambassador at the time saying, "Yes, we'll disarm. We'll disarm in 1,000 years." So, you know, on the whole, we're looking at a democracy deficit where you can go out and protest, and you can organize social movements, but that's going to have an effect on some governments. The question is, you know, how do those of us that live in democratic states, how do we potentially in the future bring round, you know, the Chinese Communist Party elites or whoever's running Russia to an idea that it's, you know, somehow in a shared interest to manage the risks that nuclear weapons pose. So I think, yeah, the deficit of democracy in this case is what the key stumbling block is.
If I can hop in and supplement briefly. First of all, it's noteworthy, I think, that none of the agreements that we have and have benefited from in the past, START, INF, comprehensive test ban, the self-styled realists denounced them and said they were unrealistic right up until the ink was on the paper. So I don't think the apparent lack of success should put anybody off. Certainly, you know, in the high Cold War, the peace movements were demanding what came into the INF Treaty. Recently, has met its demise, as we know, but nevertheless effective for many years. And everyone said this is a completely unrealistic demand. And yet a few years later, it was signed. On the democratic deficit, this is important, but it's worth noting the Chinese signed up to the nuclear test ban in the 1990s because they saw it was in their state interest to do so. And from a realist perspective, arms control and disarmament can make sense even for authoritarian states. But my last point really is to pick up the heart of the question, which, as I recall it, concerned states making rational decisions based upon perceived threat perception to develop weapon systems. Well, I wouldn't discount that as being part of it. But I think, as we see, for example, with the demand for new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles in America, the power of industry and local interests can be decisive when there is no real strategic rationale. And perhaps the best example of that, I think, is the AUKUS, the tripartite submarine development plan, which, you know, my old friend Joe Cirincione, I think, rightly put his finger on it with. So this is basically about a profits grab away from French industry. There's no way these technologies are actually going to be deployed in anything less than a generation, possibly 30 years, in terms of developing an industry in Australia. But in the meantime, a great deal of money is there to be made. And I think it's extremely depressing, after all the analysis of the structures of arms race influence, that IR scholars still take at face value the strategic interests. After all, if we really were that concerned about the Chinese, the Anglo-Americans and Australians would have made sure to keep their old ally France on board as part of a quadripartite deal of the West to deal with China. But clearly the threat can't be so great because they're quite happy to alienate the French in the process. So I think we need to be a little bit more rigorous in using the findings of our analysis of of arms races and not buy into another round of supposed IR realist rationale.
Thank you, Dan. That was a really useful analysis. And on that note, it's 3 o'clock, so I'd like to wrap up and once again thank all of our panelists for their contributions today. And a reminder for everybody that the next webinar, the US-China Media War, will commence on the 17th of February at 2 p.m.
Well,
Thank you
thanks
very much.
everybody. And I hope, John, Cameron, we can find ways to continue to work together.
I'd like to take up this occasion to announce that Scrap Weapons is planning to hold a conference in SOAS University in September that seeks to build a constituency to work towards the implementation of a 4th special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, and that the primary aim is to realize the legal commitment to nuclear and general disarmament in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Scrap Weapons will contribute with the presentation of a draft treaty that I will share on the chat on world disarmament, and prototypes of a global weapons tracking system link that will also be shared on the chat. Thank you very much.
And you can stay up to date with all our work and join our newsletter or follow Scrap Weapons on social media. And just a reminder that a video recording of this webinar will soon be available on the Scrap Weapons YouTube channel. And thank you all for your participation.